Are you
Yeah.
interested in reading Plato's Republic, but the book is just too gosh darn long? Or maybe you've read it and you're not sure what the important
Yeah.
topics are and how they apply to your life. Well, you're in luck because today's episode, we're coming back to the best books in philosophy series and discussing
Woo.
Plato's Republic. This is the Existential Stoic podcast. I am Randy. That's Danny. What's going on, Danny?
What's up, Randy? Yeah, I love the Republic, man. This is a great book. I'm glad to come back to this series. And I think it's a great book too, because I think all these great works have so much information about how you can live and that can help you live your life. I think they're so important in that sense. Even if you're not studying it and stuff, they're still great because there's so much value in them just for that, just for maybe getting a deeper sense of how we should live our lives, virtue means, stuff like that. It's important.
Yeah, and this is definitely the elementary or beginner's philosophy book. Like this is every philosophy 101 class.
Yeah.
Plato's Republic. That's what you need to read, whether you like it, whether you understand it, whether you don't care for it, all of
Yeah.
it. This is like the book to know. So in this episode, we're going to go over a few of the most important topics because it is a long book and clearly we're not going to
Yeah.
waste your time. But we're going to go over some important stuff like the allegory of the cave, probably one of the most important things.
Always exciting.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about the philosophical life because they do talk about that a lot. Also, justice, that's discussed a lot. And maybe we'll touch on
Yeah.
some other things. So to begin with, Plato's Republic actually is a story of
Yeah.
Socrates, huh?
Yeah, I mean, so Plato, in a lot of his work, Socrates is like the philosophical sage, right? He was his teacher. He didn't write anything down. And so you get this kind of caricature of Socrates and all the dialogues that's like this, but he's like the uber, philosopher, best arguer. It's
Yeah, I
like,
mean, he has a whole
but it's great.
method. He has a whole
Yeah,
method named after
he
him, the
does have a
Socratic
method.
method of just asking
Okay.
questions. And a lot of people consider him the smartest person ever because he said all I know is that I know nothing.
Yeah, I mean, actually, the Oracle of Delphi even said that he was the wisest.
Really?
So, yeah, that was
Wow.
important.
Huh.
Yeah,
I would kind of argue that, even though a lot of people idolize him, he didn't have everything put together. Like his home life was
yeah,
in shambles. He was married to a nag. They didn't get along, and he basically just
yeah.
spent his whole day out on the porch waxing Socratic because he probably didn't want to spend time with her.
Yeah, I mean, it is funny. I think that's a good point, right? Like, the I think it's always good to read these great works, but also keep in mind that it's a person. It's at the end of the day, these are all people that wrote them. No matter how elevated you think they are, they're still a person, so there's still going to be flaws, and I think that's helpful though, because that's why we see these individuals, at least in the represented in their works or in their lives, always trying to pursue that truth, that knowledge, that good life, and maybe not getting there, but they're still engaged in the pursuit. And I think that just shows that, it's a struggle. We're all going to, it's a lifelong struggle. It's not something simple. I think that's a good lesson in itself, right?
Absolutely. If the smartest guy
Yeah.
on the planet doesn't have it all together, then why should you? So I
Yeah.
think we should probably start with the allegory of the cave because this is probably, if you get
Yeah.
one thing from Plato's Republic, it should be this. And then also we should discuss how it applies to life in general. So you
Other
want to,
stuff. Yeah.
yeah, you want to explain the allegory of the cave?
Sure. Why not? So, I mean, it's an allegory, right? So the idea is, he says, imagine, that you have, imagine you have some prisoners or some individuals that are held captive in a cave, and they're chained and bound, so they can't move, and they're held that way from very, very young. So it's all they know. And they're just stuck looking at a wall in the cave. So that's all they can see. They can talk to each other. And basically, the only thing that illuminates the whole room is a fire behind them. So there's sort of this kind of like shadowy, fiery light that's cast on the wall. And whoever's holding them prisoner, they walk, and they use these sort of cutouts to display images on that shadow, reflections on the wall. And he says, imagine, if this is all you know, this is your whole world, this is your reality. And we let one of those guys go at one point, and, the exits finds the exit, gets outside. You know, at first would be blind by the light, right? The sunlight would be overwhelming because you're used to this shadowed sort of existence that's really dark and, not quite real. And then you'd be kind of probably blown away by the fact that like there's a world, you were used to this world in this cave. This was your life. This was your reality, your truth. And all of a sudden, you find out once you exit this cave that your truth is completely false. That everything you thought you knew is false. And he says, it would take time for the person to be able to see. They might start seeing images, things, and eventually they'll be able to look at the sun. And then they'd face this sort of problem, right? Of like, should they go back down and tell their buddies that like, hey, this isn't real? And if they go back down, what happens? Because, imagine if like, imagine maybe a good example of this is like, and this happens probably a lot, right? Kid from a small town goes to college, learns a bunch of stuff, goes back home, thinks they're right, and starts attacking their family's views, values, how they think. Obviously, the family's not going to take that very nicely, right? And they're going to get upset. And I think what's interesting about this is, so if the person goes back into the cave, how are the other persons going to react? Are they going to take this information like, oh yeah, you must be right. Okay, obviously there's a world out there where this is all a lie. We've been living a lie our whole lives. All we need to do is, follow you. Are they going to, attack them? Are they going to want to stay where they are? And so it raises like a ton of interesting questions, I think, about how we see the world and, the things we believe to be true.
Yeah.
It's a very short synopsis.
Yeah. And so initially he kind of discussed the allegory in that this was the need of philosophy, because when you study philosophy, you go outside the cave, you learn all these things, and then you have the difficult task of sharing these things with people who may not know it yet. But I do,
like education, right, can help us get to that sort of, eye-opening scenarios where we see at least that our assumed ideas were wrong, or the way we thought was not correct. Yeah.
I do find it interesting how in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, it's kind of the same thing where Zarathustra goes up into the mountain, gets enlightened, comes back down, basically going back into the cave, and the people don't want to hear what he has to say. So it's kind of a scenario that we see many times throughout life. So how does this actually apply to our lives, real life?
Well, I think it's interesting, right? I think, on the one hand, you could say that we're all in some sense in caves, right? That all of us see the world a certain way. We have a point of view, a perspective. And I think for an important point for Plato and for Socrates is that they believe there was an objective truth, right? That there is this thing, truth, that we could all, access. But most of us, it's the world we think we know, the perspective we have is probably flawed. It's probably like this illusion, right? Where we're seeing shadows on a wall. And education can help us get to a deeper understanding of the world, maybe closer to truth. We might be able to understand some, at least recognize that what we thought we knew was false. But I think the way this applies to life too is by understanding that for everyone, really, we're all in these sort of caves. And that prevents us from, in a way, seeing things for what they are, prevents us from being open to new ideas because we're resistant to them. If we're angry when people come and tell us that, what we think is false. And you see this all the time, right? Look at how look at how the partisan sort of thinking, the infighting, right? The way people sort of cling to ideas and resist even listening to others if they have a different viewpoint. I mean, all of that shows that, we really do, we cling to our beliefs. We're very afraid of sort of losing them because our whole world's founded on these ideas. And if they get shattered, our whole world gets shattered. Or at least we think that way. And I think one of the things, that's a crucial lesson here is like, if we learn, we can help ourselves sort of maybe not only understand how other people see the world and understand their situation, but also recognize that, part of life is trying to get out of this cave, is trying to see the world maybe as it is, or to the best of our ability.
Yeah. And I also like the positive side of it, in that no matter what you're seeing right now, there exists something outside of that. So like something that they talk a lot about in positive psychology is don't look at what's right here. Look at things as they can be. So like a lot of people get trapped in the cave seeing the little things on the wall and they think that's life, because right now they're at a minimum wage job. They hate that job. They hate their partner.
Yeah.
They're in really bad shape, but that's a very limited perspective. Whereas if you realize that a lot more is possible and you can actually look forward, use your imagination, see into the future, see what's possible and start working towards that, then a lot more becomes possible. And I like that aspect of the allegory of the cave where kind of anything is possible.
I like that too. I also like, the idea too that we're in a sense, we're bound by our ideas, right? In an important sense. And I think, what you're mentioning too is important. This idea that, there is a way to break out. But it is hard because most of us, especially in our day-to-day lives, we have our stresses, we have our worries. It's easy to lose focus, to get a very narrow, to just focus on that wall in front of us and see nothing else, because we think that's, that gives us meaning. It gives us a way to explain our existence, but it might not be helpful in a way, right? It might be harming us. And learning new things, trying to, examine life. And I think this is another side of it, what was it? Socrates is it, at least we attribute to him saying that the unexamined life is not worth living, right? The idea that, you need to examine life, your own life, the world around you. And by doing that, you gain a deeper understanding and you start to see that there's maybe problems with the way you look at things. Maybe that, the things you thought were true aren't, the things you were taught. And that helps you also maybe break free of this sort of being bound in this cave, being trapped in this cave, maybe getting out of there, which is, I think, also an interesting idea. This idea that there's like, education is sort of this, in a way, it's represented like an ascent, right? You get to climb out and you get to get outside and see things as they are.
Yeah. Another thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of the allegory of the cave that I always find interesting is these enlightened people feel like it's their duty to share everything they learned with everyone else. And so like I've heard this saying, a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. And if it rhymes, it's got to be true. So like
it always is, yeah.
Yeah. So but like with that, I find it funny how like these enlightened people always think they have to come and teach other people. And I can kind of see it where like they feel like, yes, they have a moral obligation to share what they've learned with other people. But I would say like only if those other people are willing, that and I think a lot of problems come because people like want to, you need to listen to what I have to say because my way is right and this is the truth. And that causes so many issues in the world, is that people are trying to indoctrinate their truth into others, as opposed to just like, what happened if the guy who got out of the cave came back into the cave, and then instead of trying to like indoctrinate the other people with his truth, what if he just helped them get out of the shackles so they could go look on their own? Well,
I think that's the interesting question. And there's some debate about what what this means, I guess, because he could have just stayed outside, right? He could have just relaxed out there, kept learning, and lived his own little like hermit life where he, pursued truth. But we see with Socrates too, and how he interacts with others in the dialogues, at least, it's not necessarily telling people what's true. It's using the Socratic method, asking questions to get them to see that their view is potentially wrong or wrong. And that, at least, because one of the things I like about this is that idea that if you can get somebody curious, you can get somebody to see that they might be wrong. That's going to motivate them to then pursue truth, right? To try and correct that. Hopefully, you can't make them. And you're right. You can't just go down and be like, "Hey, get a chalkboard out. Here's what's true. You're wrong. Okay, see you guys later." Right? That's not going to work. They're not going to care. So I think it's about sort of getting people to be interested in, getting curious, right? Perplexed, so that they can actually, and that's dealt with in other dialogues like the Meno, but also kind of trying to get them to sort of get there on their own also. And I think that's why you see this, we saw it in Zarathustra, you see it in the Allegory of the Cave too, this desire to come back down, I think, and try and help other people. We want other people to see the truth too, maybe. And also it's a way for us potentially to also keep going forward. By helping them see it, by helping them understand, we also keep learning ourselves. And that's probably part of it. I don't know. It is an interesting thing, isn't it? That, they feel this obligation. And I think how you do it matters, though, whether you, try and force it or whether you just tell them they're wrong. And I think that's why it goes poorly if you just go like, you don't know what you're talking about. This is all false. Your worldview is wrong.
when you were just saying that, something clicked in my mind. It was like either the Buddha or somebody else who was enlightened was saying that you're not enlightened until the whole world is enlightened. So
Yeah,
thinking, and that's kind of like thinking yourself separate from the world. Because if that one person just left the cave and they became enlightened and then didn't come back to help, well, that's like they're not helping out the rest of the world, which is essentially the rest of themselves.
yeah, right. And I mean, also too, like that idea of humanity and progress, right? And trying to get people to see that maybe there's a better way of doing things. Maybe that we're wrong. Maybe there's all of these things are important. Yeah,
I've been talking about a great segue. That's like
yeah,
the
right.
perfect segue because he talks a lot about governments and like which ones are
Yes, he
good,
does.
which ones are bad, democracies, oligarchies, timocracies, all these different things. So, what's your take from all the talk about politics in there?
I guess we should mention, right? So the Republic is, in the dialogue, they decide to try and set up an hypothetical ideal city state, right? And this whole dialogue starts because there's a discussion about justice and what is justice, and is it better to be just, or is it better to be, basically to be unjust, to be, to go after self-interest, right? Essentially.
I
And they
like
set up
that.
the
I
okay.
like that a lot because the part that I like is that where they ask like are people being or are people being just because they actually want to, or are they being just because they're afraid of
Yeah,
getting caught? Because I think about
yeah.
that all the time. Like, are people good because they want to be good, or are they good just because the punishment for getting caught is like severe enough to make it not worth being bad?
Yeah, or that it's beneficial to look good, right? That,
Mm.
if we live with other people, so if we appear good and then we cheat a lot and do other things when no one's looking, right? That can
But
be
as long
beneficial
as
to
our
ourselves.
Instagram profile looks good,
Yeah,
no
it's all that
problems.
matters. Yeah, no, it raises those interesting questions, right? About like, are people acting a certain way because they actually believe that and that's actually who they are? Or is it because of external factors like, social pressure or a fear of punishment, a fear of, maybe like being ridiculed, whatever? Because, that means you're being good, but not really because you think it's right or you understand why. You're just doing it to fit in, to conform, or to, not suffer something that you perceive to be worse. And that's a crucial question about, basically what motivates your actions and whether or not you are acting in a way that's authentic or consistent, right, with who you are and with your motivations. So yeah, right. I mean, there's literally so many interesting questions raised in this dialogue that we won't have time
Well,
for, but
I and
yeah,
um, I like when they talk about justice, how they're talking about that both applying to the individual and to the state.
yeah,
And I really like that because it just makes sense. It's like if everybody is acting just, you're going to have a just state. And like if
yeah,
everybody's acting in the best interest, then you're going to have like a great place that acts in the best interest of everyone. But it's when you have these bad actors and like people thinking that, oh no, the government has to control everything and I'm not responsible for any of this. It's the other party's fault. Like that's when we run into problems.
yeah. It's interesting. They set up this, like, when they set up the ideal city state, hypothetically in the work. The whole point of it is to try and mirror or to offer sort of what is it, a macro picture for the micro, which is the soul. So they make this representation that the city state would be organized like our soul is organized in similar parts, and then they try and ask what would justice look like, or what's a just organization of those parts. And it's really, I mean, it's interesting because they throw out democracies thrown out because it's, you know every part has an equal say, and that doesn't really get us anywhere, because obviously, reason should be the controlling, or the not controlling in a tyrannical sense, but we should have rationality, right? They think that a just soul is rationally organized, that being just is being a rational person. And we see this reflected in the city state with the philosopher kings ruling over, and having that sort of rule where they can rule in a rational, reasonable way, not tyrannically, not with an oligarchy, not in these situations where power is sort of incorrectly used, or used in a way where it's sort of, I guess you could say, like, the rest of the city-state's kind of not kept in line rather than being brought in line in the right way. If that makes sense.
Yeah,
Being consistent.
definitely. I want to touch on the philosopher king because I guess two reasons. So one, like Socrates believes that the philosopher king is like the ideal form of government, and I think we have yet to experience that in the thousands of years since
Yeah.
since he's
Ever.
written this. Yeah, but I mean, it's an interesting thing because I heard Naval Ravikant talk on the topic of philosopher kings because he was talking about how Socrates says philosopher king is the way to go, and he's like, well, if you're
Yeah.
going to do that, and he's looking at it from the point of view of the individual, not particularly the state. So he's like,
Oh, okay.
if the goal is to be a philosopher king, you should actually logistically become a king first and then a philosopher. So what he's saying is get rich first and then you'll have the time to become a philosopher because it takes a long time to become a philosopher. You have to support yourself. Whereas if you work on becoming rich first, then you'll have the time to be a philosopher and then you can have everything because, you know, becoming a king, getting rich can be difficult for a lot of people. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, and
I mean,
becoming a philosopher can be difficult as well. So, you know, stack them up how you
well,
will.
definitely lifelong. Yeah, that's funny. That's interesting. Because I mean, I think, no, I get the point. I definitely see that. I don't know if Socrates would agree or not, because I think maybe part of the problem there would be that, are you the kind of person that could be, though, that you could be a philosopher or you could be this type of person, or do you have it within you, or do you still have the time to do it correctly? Because at that point, you might not be able to then, I guess, develop everything, So I
But
don't know. Yeah, go ahead.
it's a philosopher king. It's not a philosopher and it's not a king. So you got to be
Yeah,
both of them. And
yeah, you do.
yes, and so that is kind of like it requires a lot. Because
It's
if
funny too,
there's
because
just a
oh, go ahead.
philosopher, oh sorry, if he's just a
Yeah.
philosopher and he's like destitute, many people may not talk to him. And if he's just
Yeah.
rich and he's stupid, many people may not listen to him. But when you have
Yeah.
both, and granted, it's going to be harder than just getting one of them. But when you
Yeah.
have both, that's when you can really make an impact.
Yeah, it's funny too, because what I always crack me about the Republic too is when you read it, they're setting up this ideal city state, but I don't think any of us would want to live there, because it's really not. The purpose of it is to be an ideally just organization, not anything else. And it's interesting, what Socrates suggests being necessary. So the philosopher kings, one of the reasons I think he uses that idea is that they don't necessarily want to rule. So they're not taking power because they want it. And that's important because, you're not just looking for, you're not going to, you're not going to do things just to better yourself, right? It's not out of self-interest. You're going to rule correctly if you don't want it. That's the idea. That it's not, but you're capable of ruling. That's the other thing. You have the intelligence. You're going to keep pursuing knowledge, keep pursuing wisdom. But the rest of the city state is organized in a way too, where like he has this idea of the noble lie that there'd be distinct classes within the society. So there'd be distinct organization. People would all have a role to fill. And he thinks that, we would tell them a lie when they're young, basically a myth that explains their situation and makes them proud or happy to be in it effectively so that they can explain it to themselves and be proud living that in that life, in that class, without a desire to move up or down or anything. And that's interesting because it's like this idea of the need for stories, right? A need for explaining. And that's not bringing everybody out of the cave necessarily.
Yeah, but do we not already do that with like the national
Oh, yeah.
pride and everything like that goes on in the
Oh,
schools?
yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, it's really interesting how in thousands of years things just haven't changed. We deal with the same problems over and over again.
Oh, my God. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that, I think that's what's cool about this dialogue as well, is when you read it, it can be hard because on the one hand, you have this ideal city state that I don't think none of us would necessarily want to be a part of, at least from the surface, maybe if we get into it more. And then you have all this other stuff being said, like the allegory of the cave, which seems to suggest something maybe a little different. And I think all of this taken together is trying to give us some insight into how to live, what it means to live a good life, and trying to, make some of these sort of points as clear as possible that are difficult to understand.
Yeah.
Well,
did you want to touch anything else on justice?
Yeah, I mean, I think it'd be helpful just to say that, for justice for Socrates, at least as far as I understand, in the Republic is really about, character and basically our mental state, if you will, our character in the sense of like our they divide it in three parts as reason, right? Our spirits, like our emotions, our passions, and our appetites. So if you think of this as like, what motivates us, our mental or, structure. Um, and justice for them is having sort of all the parts doing their job, doing them well, but functioning in harmony so that you're rational. The idea is that you don't force yourself to be rational by denying all of your appetites or, denying your emotions, denying your passions, but instead, fulfilling them in a healthy way and bringing them into a rational state.
That's a great one, and that's something that's very practical that can actually be applied today, which is
Yeah.
awesome. Which is like the idea of taking those appetites. So whatever they are, whether they're for watching Netflix, whether they're for eating junk food, whether they're for sex or alcohol or cigarettes or whatever these appetites are that we have that everybody thinks, oh, it's so bad. And it's like, no, not necessarily. Like this can be used as the carrot before the donkey or whatever it's called.
Yeah.
Where basically
Yeah.
it can be your motivation to actually get stuff done. Like if you know what your appetites are, then you fulfill your appetites only after you do the necessary work. And that way it's that impetus that helps you to get the stuff done. So you can use those appetites with your reason to help accomplish some pretty cool stuff.
Yeah, and I think too, we see this, it's also like it's similar to what we see in Aristotle with his virtue theory. I think we see this a similar idea too in Nietzsche, which is also about knowing yourself, right? Knowing what your tendencies are so that you can reach a harmonious union between all the parts of you. Find that balance. Because I think the important thing for within the Republic too is this idea that, a just person has this balance of character. They have this sort of like I think of it as like a calm inner state where they're not thrown off easily by sort of the whims of by chance, whims of chance or just things that happen in the world that are out of their control, because they have a stable, controlled self, right? They know how to deal with themselves. They are rational. They'll think things through. They're not going to get thrown off by emotions and stuff. I think this is something we all struggle with, right, in our
Isn't it
lives.
isn't it funny
Yeah.
how like all these things come up and we think, oh, this is the thing that's going to ruin me. I'm going to completely like I'm going to die or whatever it is. And
Yeah.
like if you look back at history, it's like I've gotten through everything. What's the big deal? Most of it doesn't even
Yeah.
seem like a big deal at all now. But it's like every new thing that comes up, oh, this is going to be it. Just why I'm better worry about this because something needs to happen. Yeah.
Well, and I think that's it, right? It's like, why do we throw ourselves off course and we really make things so much harder than they need to be? And I mean, all the time. I just did this to myself this week. Like I was focusing on one thing, lost sight of other stuff, made my life more difficult for no fucking reason whatsoever, right? And it's like if you just think it through and really like look at your past, take a step back, and do the rational thing, you realize, hey, wait, I can do this. It's not that big of a deal, but it's like we lose perspective very quickly. And I think, this is why, why justice or why at least for, virtue or being good is beneficial because we're really developing ourselves in a healthy way. We're realizing or perfecting our own natures. And by doing that, we're better equipped to live our lives, right? In
Hmm.
the best way possible.
I actually have a question for you, kind of based on that and a little bit
Yes.
of other stuff. So, like the goal is the philosopher king. So, is it with the idea of the philosopher? Is that somewhat related to being enlightened, or is being enlightened kind of like the theory, the form for the philosopher to go after, or are they not related at all?
Huh. That's interesting. I mean,
Because there's
the
we were talking about the allegory of the cave where he leaves the cave, becomes enlightened or a
yeah.
philosopher, and then he comes back in. So I'm wondering, like, is this whole or maybe I'm using the wrong words. I don't remember if I actually said enlightened in the Republic, uh, but like maybe that's the
Yeah,
form
like
that the philosopher goes after, and then never can attain it because we look at all these philosophers and they all have flaws, you know.
yeah.
So
Yeah. I mean, it's wisdom. I guess I would say the ideal is like wisdom maybe would be correct.
mm,
The wise person. Which is, I mean, enlightened is a similar term, right? I guess you could use it in a similar way. Yeah, it's interesting. The theory of the forms, right? The idea that there is this perfect realm, and the outside of the cave might represent that, which is like truth. I mean, one way to think of the theory of the forms is think of it as like truth. It's these perfect ideas, right? The perfect concepts of things that you can't meet within the experience, but that they, everything they say takes part in them. That's how they, I always think of it as like, the theory of the forms represents objective knowledge or objective ideas. And understanding the world in part is trying to get a better understanding of that, is trying to find these objective truths, trying to understand things clearly, right? Or as clearly as we can, whether it's possible or not, it's that pursuit. And so it's interesting. Yeah, I think the philosopher king, it's wisdom is something that, that idea of being wise is something we always must pursue, right? It's something that's pursued throughout life. It's not an easy thing to acquire. And you're right. I mean, everybody has flaws. So in the Republic, the interesting thing is the philosopher kings, they talk about, identifying these individuals young and then basically pulling them into a special program, if you want to think of it that way, where they know the truth, they know all this stuff, and then they help society to sort of have this organization to be, balanced, to be happy, to be, productive. And so it's this interesting idea too, where, at least in the Republic, not everyone can be a philosopher king. Not everyone can be wise in this way, but then the people that are have a responsibility, it seems, to help those, whether they want to or not, to help everyone else, right? Find this sort of maybe organization and productivity that works well. And I think that's an interesting idea too, because we all like to think that we're all wise and that we all can be super smart. No, and it's like, maybe that's not true, but what is the responsibility then for those who are virtuous, who can attain this state? Should they help others get there? Is there a requirement, and why? And I think, this sort of idea that humanity, like you mentioned before, is kind of, we're all together in this. So just bringing yourself up doesn't necessarily raise our species or raise anything else, right? And if you just reach enlightenment, it's like, well, great, you still die. Why not try and make things better? Why not try to bring everybody else up a little bit too, so that continues, or maybe more people can experience something better.
Yeah. I think that's interesting that they try and find them at a young age, because I'm thinking like, how would you actually do that? And really, at a young age, really the only thing you could probably pick out is if they're going to be rich. So you could pick out the kings, and then the philosopher part you kind of have to guess on, and then as you're training them, some flunk out. But like, thinking about it, Marcus Aurelius, I think he was a good example of a philosopher king, because he was a king, he was a Roman emperor, but also
Yeah.
you read his meditations, like he clearly knows how to think about very important things. And so,
Yeah.
at least to me, he was probably the best example of a philosopher king we've had so far.
I think he's definitely a good example of someone who tried to live, you might say, that way, right? Where they tried to embody this idea of, like, I mean, he was very modest in a lot of respects, right? And how he dressed and the things he did. He wasn't lavish, wasn't wasting money on himself. Because I think that's important too. When they say philosopher kings, I think it's just to get that idea of ruling. They weren't really, I don't think they were, it wasn't this lavish life either, though. That's the other thing that's interesting, right? It's really a rejection of that in a lot of ways, because that would lead you to also, self-interest and making choices that are problematic as well. So, but it's having the power to then, right, do these things and maybe determine the rule for the whole city state. I think that's the important part. And Marcus Aurelius definitely had that. So I think he is an interesting example of someone who really tried to live this way that we don't often see, because most people in power, right, it's very selfish. They want it. And I mean, a lot of, that's the other interesting thing. In his notebooks and stuff, a lot of it doesn't seem like he really wanted that rule either. He accepted it, which is, one thing, but he also accepted the difficulty of it because he was trying to do it well. Whereas most people, I think, that do it for their own interest, they don't care if they do the ruling part. It's not, they don't care about other people. And we see that so often.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it gives us a nice way too, like if you do get in a position of power, or to sort of evaluate our own rulers, this gives us a really interesting way to think about it. Why are they acting? Are they doing things for their own benefit? Are they really thinking about the organization, the people, society, what have you? And what does this tell us about them?
Yeah, absolutely. So anything else that we should cover while we're chatting on the important topics?
Yeah, I think this is obviously a long work. There's a lot of interesting stuff in it. We can only touch on a little bit, but I would definitely recommend. I think everybody should definitely check it out. And the idea of justice, there's a really interesting connection, I think, between the idea of justice that they discuss and virtue in general, the good life, that's worth examining. But I do want to point out again, that's I think of critical importance is, this idea of we mentioned early on about, why are we acting, examining what our motivations are. Are we doing something because we're afraid of being punished? We're afraid of, what society will say about us, or are we doing it because we believe it's right? That's a great starting point. Asking yourself, hey, what are my motivations? What are my reasons for acting? And am I really like doing things because I'm trying to just fit in, or because I'm afraid of what other people say or these beliefs, or am I doing it because I think it's actually right? And what's the difference? And I think that's a great starting point for getting to maybe a place where you can start working on virtue, working on yourself, and finding this balance, hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, if you haven't read this book yet, definitely go out and read it. It's
Yeah.
one of the foundational philosophy books, and in being so, there's a lot of different resources to help you through it if and when you get
Oh yeah.
stuck with it. So
Yeah.
it's a great one to start. You'll probably meet a lot of people who have already read it as well that you can talk with, and then you can relate with them and discuss philosophy. You can be a philosopher, and then you become a king, and all of a sudden, boom,
And boom.
philosopher king. So
Rule over your own life. It's great.
yeah. So that, in a nutshell, is Plato's Republic. This is the Existential Stoic podcast. Thank you guys so much for listening. Make sure to check us out on YouTube, also on all the podcast services. We come out twice a week with episodes. I'm Randy. That's Danny. I'll catch you later, Danny.
Later, Andy.